Welcome to Risk Engineers Talk Governance. In this episode, due diligence engineers Richard Robinson and Gay Francis discuss their recent success at VCAT and how design trumps risk assessment. We hope you enjoy the episode. Please give us a rating if you do. Also subscribe on your favourite podcast platform.
Hi Richard, welcome to another podcast session.
Hello Gay, good to see you again.
Good to see you. We do see each other often. Today we're going to talk about our VCAT success and our safety and design issue again. We have covered this a number of times in a couple of other episodes, particularly in season 2, which we did in episode 1 of season 2, which was safety and design, and then episode 2 of the same season we discussed the demise of ALARP in major hazards. And we have finally got an outcome from VCAT tribunal that we were expert witnesses for, and it was in our favour, which was a part of a surprise, I think.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think from our point of view, it was the only logical outcome, but it's very encouraging for the legal system to support that position.
But it was against other decisions the decision that Member Whitney made was different. She came to a different conclusion than other VCAT.
She had to roll the system, and she had to make particularly clear that she'd done it in a way that if somebody appealed to the Supreme Court, it would be likely to survive the experience. But that's what competent
members do.
Now, just for the record, if anybody's interested, the decision was, the date of the order is 12th of March 2024, so a couple of weeks ago. The citation is Nasralla, Nasralla versus Hobsons Bay City Council 2024, VCAT 212. That's if you want to look it up, because all this information is available publicly, and so you can go and look it up if you wish to. It's actually an 88-page decision, which for VCAT is a true little monster, and about 2/3 of it's to do with planning law and the application of the way in which the major hazards advice and how it was represented and so forth was put forward.
Just before you go on, it's probably just giving a quick summary of what it was. So it was the application for a building permit to provide 2 new dwellings on a piece of land that only currently had one old house on it. So it was to upgrade that to 2 new dwellings. However, it was in the outer safety zone of a major hazard facility in the Hobson Bay area, and so it didn't have a formal planning overlay on it, but work cover as a responsible, or not as a responsible authority, as an advisory authority, went against building the 2 dwelling, and that was that it increased the population at that site.
So it was a societal risk argument. The current house normally would have 4 persons present in it, and all other things being equal, if you build 2 houses, you'd have 8 persons present, and presumably if you didn't do anything, they'd be subject to the equivalent level of risk, which means there'd be 8 people at risk rather than 4 people at risk, and that was the advice from major hazards. Now, the trick about major hazards was, though, remember, previously they used to do it on a target level of risk basis, like the likelihood of killing a single person by 1 by 10 to the minus 7 per annum, and then plotted a risk curve. And this region used to be beyond that boundary. And so the business of knocking down an old house and putting up 2 units or 2 houses was a very popular activity, and indeed the blocks on either side of this particular house had just that done to it. So it wasn't as though the young people who were developing the site were doing anything new or novel. And what was particularly galling for them was that they'd gone through the whole planning process, and then as a last gasp, the council had written to major hazards, and major hazards had changed their planning or advice. And so rather than doing it on the individual risk contour, it said, it's a credible worst case scenario, it's basically a kilometre away from this site, if you're in there, no go.
Yeah, so they changed it to consequence basis, which we discussed in previous podcasts.
Now, as I said, it was an 88-page decision and it took 6 months, and we were a little bit puzzled as to why it was taking us so long. But when we looked at the comprehensive nature of the decision, it became pretty clear why the member had done it that way, because she was trying to cover all bases and prevent any further issues coming back, particularly an appeal to the Supreme Court. Now, as I mentioned earlier, about 2/3 of the judgment was to do with planning matters, And it's probably a more comprehensive view of planning matters. No, we're obviously not lawyers, and we're certainly not comprehensive in planning law. But from our reading of it was one of the more, and if anybody's interested in that application of planning law in Victoria, it's one of the more comprehensive ones that I've seen. It also included a thing to do with the appeal to Governor and Council, which was, I have to say, completely new to us, because I'd never seen that one before. And that seems to be because if you're dealing with someone having to appeal to Supreme Court, that's a pretty expensive thing. And so in the case that hardship or something like that was involved and there was a general policy issue involved, which is the case in this situation, because other people had had houses rejected and other people had had houses approved, depending on the whim of the previous different members making decisions. It was that had to be that comprehensive. Now, what particularly pleased us was the core decision, which I got to say from our point of view is about the last 20%, because there are a number of appendices in the decision as well, was that WorkSafe had gone for consequence. They'd said there's an inner safety area and an outer safety area, which was, I think, was
300 metres and a kilometre.
And a kilometre. This building was inside the outer safety area, but not in the inner safety area. And after an awful lot of yelling and screaming with the regulator and the major hazard facility concerned, everybody agreed that the credible worst case in that outer safety area was broken windows, which is in the safety case summary from 2018, basically from overpressures and things like that. There was no suggestion that there would be missiles coming out of the plant that could get that far, or any of those sorts of things. Now, what slightly confused us was that nowhere in all this had anybody considered safety and design to deal with what was now a known, credible, consequence-driven hazard.
Yep.
And the core issues from our viewpoint were if you're inside the house and an explosion over pressure comes your way, if the windows blow in and it turns into shrapnel, and this is a well-known terrorist modus operandi, you could get impaled. And the correct way to design against that, and it's to put laminated windows in there. And one of our associates in New Zealand, Dr. Frank Stocks, was busily designing the new Auckland airport, and amongst other things, he was fretting about people leaving explosives around, and they were busily putting laminated windows around the place to deal with that hazard. So this is a recognised good practice, although I've got to say it's not anywhere in any particular standard per se.
No.
Although that's not true for high explosion major,
Facilities.
Yeah, for facilities.
But not for
the domestic
usual
purpose, that's
houses,
correct.
Yes.
And the other hazard which we were concerned about was that if you put a tile roof in the area and you have an explosion over pressure coming your way, tiles and things sitting on gargoyles, whatever attractive thing you want to put on your roof, get knocked off, and then these things fall to the ground and can obviously hit people on the ground and around them. And we said tin roofs or steel roofs, colour bond roofs, are a better way from a design viewpoint. And if you did both these things,
that would address the two hazards.
Yeah,
of
the
concern.
critical consequences. And in any event, the event would be rare. I mean, because that's the whole point of the major hazard safety case regime, and nobody's any doubt about its rarity. So that part wasn't in question. And if you did these things, it wouldn't actually provide the design. Now, what was really odd from our point of view is when we reviewed the plans, it looked like they had almost designed for this particular hazard, even though at the time
it hadn't been on the radar.
Hadn't been on the radar because it had a steel roof. I mean, if you're against big hailstones breaking tile roofs up, a steel roof is a much superior way to go.
And I think that's modern design anyway. There's not many houses that design with, well, not in our area anyway,
it's normally more economic to put a steel roof on, colour bond, and that was already specified. Whilst it wasn't on the plan, shown on the plans, the advice from these owners, the Nasrallas, were that the architect advising them already said we plan to put laminated on the windows, but that was from thermal. It wasn't necessary. It wasn't on the plans for any.
It was an heat efficiency viewpoint or energy
So that was going to be there anyway. And then when we looked at the plans, and completely to our surprise, the only on the second floor, the only place where there might have been a window facing the plant, where you get the reflective wave and the greater pressure, there was no window there. It was just a blank wall. And if I'd been asked to design a building to deal with that pressure wave, that's what you would have done. We were obviously quite surprised by this, and we could sort of just say, look, if you were going to design for the hazard as spelt out by the major hazard facility, as certified in effect by the major hazards, these are the controls you put in place, and they were already there. And after the 88 pages, Member Whitney said, I agree, and didn't even require the planning permit to be changed beyond that which had already been notionally by the council, since all those controls that we would have expected to be in place had already been agreed to be there. Now, the reason why this is so important, and Gay's just nodding her head wisely over there, is because the business of working out what the credible worst-case consequence is and then designing for it is clearly, according to VCAT, the way forward.
Yes, and this would appear to be the first decision that's been made on that basis.
Correct.
So that makes it really interesting, because that gives sort of councils and organisations or councils that have major hazard facilities in their municipality an additional tool that says, well, we can actually design and have houses in these areas, in these outer safety zones, because there's precautions available to deal with them. So it's almost putting and I don't know whether this exists formally, I don't think it does. There doesn't appear to be a major hazard overlay on any of the planning permits or planning procedures that we can see. But it's really interesting that some of these things haven't been put forward for new buildings and new dwellings in areas with major hazard facilities.
Yeah, and it's something we haven't understood. I mean, as we pointed out in our opinion, it actually doesn't make much sense, because if you're in a bushfire overlay, you have to design for bushfires. If you're in an earthquake zone, you have to design for earthquakes. If you've got a serious windstorm around, you have to design for windstorm. What you have to do is design for whatever location you find yourself. And that's something which we hammer in our texts and everything else. That, I mean, if you live near a major hazard facility, you've got to take it into account. That's just obvious. And the closer you are, the more you've got to design for. And so the example we give, if you're immediately adjacent to it, you might wind up in an underground reinforced concrete bunker with its own air supply without a view or anything. It'll be fiendishly expensive, and one would imagine you wouldn't want to live there,
Not so
but it would be safe.
Yeah. So there's things that you can do. So the safety and design element, and I think, just from a town planning viewpoint, all of those things hadn't been taken into account. Now, I don't know whether there's not the expertise in council to deal with these things, or engineering design to be able to bring that into it.
Councils have been pretty much de-engineered in the last 20 or 30 years.
But we were the only technical people involved in this particular case.
Yeah, and that was a bit of a surprise to me too, because there was no expert witness
For the council.
or for the major hazard facility, or for that matter, major hazards. The only people that actually turned up were people representing the legal aspects
And the policy sort of
and legal and
position.
policy aspects. So overall, I mean, there's some larger issues, and probably the subject of another podcast, which could be sort of talked about here. I suppose the one that could possibly the most, and which we hammered in there significantly, you see, what frustrated us, if you didn't improve the design at all and just left the existing house there, the 4 people living in the existing house were subject to broken windows and bits being blown off the roof, i.e. relatively, they were in a more dangerous situation than the 8 people in the new houses that were designed for that hazard. And so it was lower risk to develop than not to develop.
So
but
from our viewpoint, you're potentially setting people up for a fall by not approving improvements.
Well, that's correct. And that's not in the council's interest, it's not in the people who live there's interests, and it's not in the interest of the major hazard facility. So how that situation could arise in the first place was something that we just didn't get.
So from our viewpoint, I think it was a pretty straightforward decision, and the solution was very, very obvious, but it was a very lengthy and difficult, complex process to go through to get 2 new dwellings approved.
Well, yes, that's right, although I have to say part of it was because we started online, and when we actually went to the VCAT hearing in person, I think that did bring things to a head and get everything functioning a lot faster. Anyway.
So I think we're pretty chuffed with ourselves that we got a good result for the Nazarellas, and safety and design was the way to go.
Well, the other interesting thing was that there had been a number of appeals to the Supreme Court on this whole matter and the way it should be done. And the member Whitney is obviously very much aware of that and actually tried to address all those cases because she lists all the previous cases that might be the case. And we know one of them, which we're doing for another client, that had gone to Supreme Court, has been sent back to VCAT. And one imagines that this decision
may influence
those further outcomes, but that remains to be seen.
All right. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.